I know I told you I'd kind of be respectful of your time, but I'm not going to do that because I still have another question about I have another question
That's
about
fine.
omega threes. When you think about what's important related to omega threes, and we'll specifically, I mean, I know you mentioned brain health, but specifically related to ocular surface issues. What do you think is important? Why do we get sometimes we'll see big studies like the DREAM study that everybody kind of says, oh, omega threes aren't helpful, but then you get a lot of other smaller studies that do find a benefit based on symptoms. And I mean, what's your thought on that? How should we be thinking about it? Hello and welcome to the Chris Wolf Podcast on iCode Media. Today I have a great conversation with Dr. Jim Stringham about carotenoids, about inflammation with dry eye inflammation, and how we can control that dry eye with omega-3s, the evidence behind different types of supplements and nutrients that we may be recommending for our patients. It's a great conversation. As always, be sure to subscribe to the podcast, write a review, share it with your friends, and support those who support us.
I want to talk about the MyDay multifocal for a second. We had the opportunity to do a preclinical trial with this lens this last summer, and there were a couple things that I thought were really helpful. The first one is that it is different than a lot of the multifocals that we've used before in our practices, where patients, especially early emerging presbyopes, really managed it didn't cause a lot of additional distance blur for them. And the other thing that was really helpful was, because we've never been involved in a clinical trial before, was to understand the sort of questions that we might ask our patients. And we ask our patients a lot of questions about their satisfaction with a contact lens, but what we weren't doing was actually having them score that themselves. So one of the parts of this that was really interesting to me was asking patients on a scale of 1 to 10 how they would score their vision, how they would score their comfort in their current lenses, and then how they would do the same on their new lenses. And it showed me a lot of times where patients would say they were happy, might rate their vision as a 6 or a 7, and then it also reframed their thinking about their current satisfaction in their lenses and allowed me to open up the door to offering other solutions. So if you haven't tried something like that in your clinical practice, I would encourage you to, and I would also encourage you to try the MyDay multifocal for your patients.
So Jim, thanks for being on. Thanks so much for doing this. Can you give our listeners a little bit of background in your research and kind of what brought you to doing research related to eyes?
Well, yeah, thanks for having me, Chris. I really appreciate it. It's a great opportunity. I mean, as a scientist, sometimes you just toil away in the basement until you're stuck in the lab. And I've been lucky enough to have some success in the lab with these nutrients that I've been studying, and to bring it sort of to the world and see people benefit is really, really cool. And so I've been doing this for about 25 years, where I'm, looking at the effects of nutrition on visual and cognitive health and performance. I've, worked at institutions like the Duke Eye Center, Air Force Research Laboratory, University of Georgia. So I've been around and studied all different kind of populations, ranging from, very young, healthy individuals, athletes, high-level athletes, professional athletes, to, the end of life, sort of, older age, effects on things like macular degeneration, Alzheimer's disease. And so, the primary takeaway here is that, folks aren't getting quite enough of the right stuff in terms of, nutritional intake. We have, a lot of evidence for that. We see these really dramatic effects from, things like carotenoids, lutein, zeaxanthin, and mesozeaxanthin, for instance. These are nutrients that I've studied in great detail for a long time. And then the omega-3 fatty acids, DHA and EPA. If you bring those up to reasonable levels in folks, you see a lot of benefits, whole body benefits, localized to the eye, the brain, and so largely my research is focused on these 5 nutrients effectively, and yeah, tons of really interesting findings. It's not just my laboratory; it's others as well. So really exciting again to be able to talk to you about these things.
Well, let's break it down and kind of put people in a position of mindset in terms of evaluating evidence. So I think on the one side, when we think about how we can evaluate what evidence we have to know if we're going to be doing good for patients by putting them on a supplement. Let's say, for example, that I have a patient, and John Nolan and I talked about this a few years ago, but we'll just start with macular degeneration. The common thing that you think about, and a common thing that clinicians are sort of browbeat into, is this idea of, okay, well, if a patient's not in category 3 or category 4, what do I do for them for macular degeneration? And the answer from AREDS is you don't do anything. And so AREDS is AREDS 1, AREDS 2, they're older studies. But how can we know without a really large randomized controlled trial like that we're doing good by approaching these patients and intervening earlier? What are your thoughts on that? And how do you look at the research to know that this is going to be valid?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. It's unfortunate that, the takeaways from the ARED studies were to basically wait till it's broken, to fix it. That's a sort of standard for, medical practice. Unfortunately, it's not, it's veering off from the preventive pathway. And it is older science, for one thing. If you look at really well-controlled trials, placebo-controlled randomized trials, and you can basically pile on, these past 10 or 15 years, dozens of these trials, if not, 100 of these trials. If you were to combine all the data from those trials, placebo-controlled, exceptionally well-run studies, you'd have easily more subjects, more participants than you would find in the AREDS trials. And you'd see as well these benefits to younger individuals. The idea of getting out in front of this thing, preventing the cumulative damage, which is really what, leads to age-related diseases, macular degeneration, Alzheimer's disease, these kinds of things. It's the tissue wearing down. It can only take so much oxidation and inflammation. And so you couple, these findings, which are incredibly strong, by the way, building these pigments up, particularly in the eye here, the macular pigment with the lutein zeaxanthin and mesozeaxanthin. You build that up, you greatly reduce cumulative damage across the lifespan. You also get, performance enhancement along the way, better contrast sensitivity, speed of processing, glare is not as bothersome, better vision in low light. All of these things we've shown in studies. So, the gold standard placebo-controlled randomized controlled trial is, that's clearly showing that we're getting benefit early. We've, along with John Nolan, I was on a study with him in early stage macular degeneration, 2017. And we showed in those folks, even in the midst of disease, we're finding, a slowed progression. We're finding visual performance improvements. And that speaks to the health of the tissue, and, namely the retina here is what we're talking about. So you look at the properties of the nutrients themselves. They're exceptional antioxidants. They do physical quenching of free radicals, which means that there isn't a chemical turnover. So you quench the free radical. These nutrients, it's physical, it's not chemical, so they can regenerate to do it over and over and over again. And this is why we see accumulation in the eye. Because you think about the retina, the highest metabolic rate of any tissue in the human body, 3 times over. It's bringing in a ton of oxygen. There's a lot of oxidative stress there in the retina. If these nutrients couldn't take multiple hits of these free radicals, they would just go away instantly. And that's not what we see. They accumulate, and they accumulate in brain tissue as well. And so, a lot of folks don't realize, they're in the eye and the brain. They're also found systemically, where they act as a systemic, antioxidant. They increase the antioxidant capacity of the blood. There are all sorts of benefits that way as well. So you take everything, in whole, and, it's hard to argue with, the health benefits. It makes a lot of sense given the biochemical properties, where they go, and then what we see in healthy individuals. If they develop age-related disease, it's very late in life. It's well into the 80s or early 90s.
I think the most important thing that I kind of take home, and I've reiterated this a number of times when I talk to other doctors about macular degeneration, is I was kind of, years ago, I was still in this mindset of, well, that's what AREDS tells us. That's all we can do. And it's almost this defeatist position. Like you said, where we're waiting until there's something medical that can be done, like an injection, when it's completely devastating, or there's enough atrophy where patients aren't seeing anyway, so we're going to do low vision on them. And the real challenge is you really wrapping your mind around macular degeneration as a disease that doesn't impact patients for 5 years or 10 years. It didn't start 5 years ago with a drusen, intermediate drusen that advanced to a large drusen that advanced to a subfoveal geographic atrophy or something like that. It started years and years and years before that. And I think that's a challenge of a randomized controlled trial in this space, specifically related to somebody that wants to see an outcome that shows, if we start patients before we see damage from macular degeneration, or significant damage for sure of macular degeneration, if we start them on some sort of supplement here, and we watch them way down the line here, that's 20, 30 years down the line, that is a preposterously expensive. And the reality of controlling a study like that would be, I would imagine, insanely difficult.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, ideally in the dream world, you do this crazy longitudinal study, 20, 30 years, because you're right. I mean, the most current data indicate that AMD starts, in your 30s, that those disease processes that, accumulate, lipofuscin that starts to accumulate in the eye, this unmetabolized garbage. It's got that fluorophore in it, A2E, light hits that, spawns free radicals. It all accumulates, and then it ends up leading to clogging up the RPE, and the story there. It's unfortunate in some ways, because what docs took away from it, from AREDS is that specific thing you have to wait. And the one, I should say, the one good piece that came out of AREDS was it raised sort of this awareness of nutrition and its potential for impacting a disease. And by the way, very significantly, preventing that, progression from intermediate to late stage. That's a good thing. But man, you're missing the point, I think, with these nutrients, because we're supposed to get them very early. I mean, I give lectures to pediatrics folks. We're finding, these effects in the womb, where mom's diet, lutein, zeaxanthin are getting to, the baby in the womb, and doing really cool things there, even for the visual system, wiring up the retina, wiring up the brain. And so, I think it starts very early. We're supposed to be getting a lot of these nutrients, and we just aren't. And so, unfortunately, I say unfortunately, of course, it's great. We're living longer. But, unfortunately, what's coupled with that are these age-related diseases if we don't, take care of ourselves properly.
So you made the point of living longer, and that's an interesting one for me to think about, because on the one hand, so from an evolution standpoint and from a Mother Nature standpoint of how our bodies work, is it in your sense, is it that we're outliving the jobs that those tissues are intended to do, or have we had just this fundamental shift over the last 800,000 years, or whatever it is, 800 to 1,000 years, where now our diets are so dramatically different that we're not consuming the things that we would have consumed before?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fantastic question. I think that, really stepping back, zooming out 50,000 foot level, you look at, we have data on, hunter-gatherer societies. There's still a couple left in the world. And when you talk about how, human physiology was designed in the first place, you can look at groups like the Hadza tribe in Tanzania and, study their diet, which is largely plant-based, as you might imagine. On average, about 70% of their calories come from plants, their intake. Also, a ton of fish, lots of these, omega-3 fatty acids coming in. And so then it doesn't it's not a stretch to, draw a contrast between that and the, modern, Western diet, obviously. So you've got, that contrast there. The question about tissues, if you maintain a healthy tissue, now granted, aging is what it is. We're aging right now, unfortunately, but it's happening. The thing is it's highly modifiable. And if you have the right stuff coming in, again, the link between, antioxidant capacity, for instance, these omega-3s as well, maintaining healthy cardiovascular tissue and other tissues in the body, is overwhelming. And so you can make a difference of 10, 15, 20 years of lifespan that way, and maintaining function. I mean, I've seen people up to the age of 107. I studied a patient, and she was sharp as a tack. You look at her, of course, non-smoker, cognitive function incredible, very high macular pigmentation. She kind of grew up on a farm and ate everything that came out of the ground, all the leafy greens and all that. And then also had a lot of fish. So there's a couple of really common, things that swim together, for these kinds of folks. And I'm not saying that everybody can live to 107, but I think that, stretching your lifespan out is not an unreasonable suggestion if you feed your body the right things. The tissues can do it. It's a matter of keeping them healthy. In areas like the brain and the eye, again, that metabolism required, it's going crazy. I mean, as a vision scientist, and I'm sure you are well aware of the, millions of reactions that are happening every second in the eye, just sitting here, looking at a screen. It's kind of staggering. And so with all of that comes a lot of, responsibility in terms of cleanup, quenching free radicals, keeping things moving efficiently. And unfortunately, that's not really what we see, the cumulative damage that comes with all of that performance and mistreating our bodies over time by not giving them the right nutrients. That can lead to poor outcomes, of course, ultimately disease.
When you think about maybe the triad, I might be missing something, but of genetics and exercise and diet, do you have a sense of which one is more important related to disease long term, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you brought that up because, sort of the trinity of health is, it's looking more like, certainly genetics plays a huge role, but more on that later. Diet, exercise, and sleep. These three things, if you can do okay, at least in those areas, you're going to be all right, I think. You might not nail them all 100%, but, you want to strive for at least, 75, 80 if you can. Genetics is an interesting thing. 50 years ago, genetics was still kind of viewed as destiny. If something was in your family, it's just a matter of time. For instance, macular degeneration. It's a matter of time before you too go blind. And, that's a defeatist, really kind of a sad kind of way of looking at things. Of course, we now know better. You can change, genetics. You can switch on, beneficial genetics, this epigenetics idea. You can do turn these positive switches on with exercise, of course. That's incredibly important. I would say, to answer your question directly, exercise and diet have about an equal contribution, almost identical. And that comes from epidemiological data on people who exercise a lot. You see risk reduction, for instance, for macular degeneration at around 50%. 50% reduction. That's incredible, right? Just for really good exercise. You look at that same population and great. Diet, and if you're in the highest quintile, you're in the highest quintile for diet in terms of carotenoids, these special, lutein, zeaxanthin, mesozeaxanthin. Same thing, 46% reduction. So, you couple those things together. You don't smoke, good exercise, you don't have to kill yourself, but, get good, sort of moderate to high level intensity exercise every day. Good diet. It's been estimated it's around 70 to 75% reduced risk for developing macular degeneration. Now, that's AMD, and that's incredible. It speaks to the power of, epigenetics. It speaks to the power of, nurture, this environment, what you can do to prevent these things. And it's not just AMD. We're talking about, anti-cancer kind of genes that are turned on. Certainly with the common pathogenesis you see with Alzheimer's disease, we're seeing these same kinds of things happening for that as well. And that is the 6th leading cause of death in America now, Alzheimer's disease. And so that's a big deal. We're seeing, through some of our studies, benefits of the nutrients for that disease as well, not simply the retina.
Well, can you talk about that a little bit? I think that's interesting because I think Alzheimer's is one that I don't think much about on a day-to-day basis, but my wife's grandmother, her other grandmother is definitely having, showing some signs of cognitive decline. My grandfather had Alzheimer's. So tell me about what your research is showing there.
So this goes back to, I went to graduate school in New Hampshire, and I used to drive about an hour south down to Boston to Harvard Medical School, where I worked first as a research assistant, and then later as a postdoctoral associate. And so with folks there, one of the sort of godfathers of this area of research, the lutein zeaxanthin and mesozeaxanthin, his name's Max Snodderly, and I studied under him. He was the guy who characterized the macular pigment in really great detail. He had wonderful pictures of rhesus monkey ovias that were cross-sectioned. You could see the pigment. This was before we even knew what the nutrients were. So he was way ahead of the curve there. This was in 1984, not when I was in graduate school, but when he actually did the study. I'm not quite that old yet. But anyway, so he found this, and suspected that, okay, because it's these things have really, really high antioxidant capacity, plus they're yellow pigments, they can block shortwave high energy light. He, predicted that, they're promoting really good visual health and performance. Turns out he was right. He ran a study that I was part of in the year 2000 that looked at cognition. So you supplement with these nutrients, and over 4 months in an older female population, we found significant improvement in cognitive function. That was the first evidence of that. So memory performance, verbal fluency, things like, name as many four-legged animals as you can in 30 seconds, go. And, they improved significantly there. It was pretty interesting versus placebo. And so, that kind of started it all off. Now, moving forward, we have lots of correlations across all age groups, from pre-adolescent children clear through to, really late life, in average age of, 75, 80 years old, where if you've got higher macular pigment, you've got higher levels in your brain of these nutrients and better cognitive performance. The most interesting study, I think, that came out of this in terms of just the overall relationship was a study from the University of Georgia. It's a centenarian study of really, really old people. And they're gracious people. They were, average age of 98. And they came to the lab, agreed to get measured, their cognitive function, macular pigment, of course, serum levels, so blood was drawn. And then most importantly, perhaps, after they passed away, they had agreed to donate their brains to the lab for analysis of these carotenoids and other nutrients in brain tissue. So if you look at the data from that study, and this was published in 2013, it's astonishing. You look at just lutein, and this was the primary carotenoid in the brain was lutein, one of the three components of the macular pigment. You find that those with good cognitive health, good cognitive performance before death, had very high levels of lutein in the brain. Those with subjective memory complaints, slightly lower. Those with mild cognitive impairment, not even pathology, just mild cognitive impairment, significantly lower levels of lutein. All the other carotenoids were basically the same in the brain. It was lutein that was accounting for, these effects. So pretty fascinating, when you think about folks who've lived that long with a relation to cognitive function and, and significantly higher lutein in the brain. The last thing I'll mention is, we did a study on people with Alzheimer's disease in, severe, moderate, mild levels of Alzheimer's disease, a supplementation study with the macular carotenoids and DHA and EPA supplement together. This was in 2018 published, and so what we found
Jim,
was that
10,
as you can imagine,
like you usually do. Is it 10, 10, and 2 plus?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. And EPA and DHA, what levels?
The ratio, yeah. And so it was 10 milligrams lutein, 10 mesozeaxanthin, 2 milligrams zeaxanthin, so the 10-10-2 ratio, and DHA 430 milligrams, and I believe 85 milligrams of EPA. So we know DHA is a primary component of the neural membrane, and sort of in the retina and the brain. A lot of fat. DHA is super important to health and performance there in the brain. So you do that. You supplement for 18 months these folks, and like I was saying earlier, it's a very difficult population to study, as you might imagine. You rely a lot on the caregivers and their reports, and so we had structured interviews with caregivers, and those folks know their patients really well, of course. And so what we find is the slower progression, significantly slower progression in those receiving the supplement versus not. And so that's preliminary evidence, certainly, but very exciting, even in the midst of disease. So I've got my parents taking these supplements, I have been taking these supplements for a long time now, and their macular pigment is very high, and certainly so far so good. They're in their mid 70s and they're doing fine, but yeah, you don't want to take any chances with that, because if you have any experience with Alzheimer's disease, it can be devastating, and you don't want that. Certainly the burden on a family. It's just a sad thing to watch. Of course, I have some experience with that as well. And so, the benefit to society could be, massive here if we can have a prophylactic, preventive, way of dealing with this. Get out in front of it, just like with macular degeneration.
Yeah. You brought up the point about nutrition, and I think it can be easy for us to sort of, as a profession, is to say, well, eat better. Eat more fish, eat more green leafy vegetables. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, that's, I always say, hey, diet, if you can get these things from the diet, it's probably better, because, fish, for instance, has more than just omega-3s in it. It's got other, proteins and whatnot. Same thing with leafy greens. You get certainly some lutein, other, 300 or 100 nutrients from spinach. Unfortunately, there are two issues here. The fact that we need a consistent supply of these nutrients, like regular, every day, that's not met by really anybody. I mean, even folks that have an exceptionally healthy diet often miss the mark on that. We did several studies while I was at the University of Georgia, and we'd characterize, everybody would estimate, the servings of fruits and vegetables every day, because we wanted to control for diet in our supplementation studies. And we'd have some of the students there that report, 8 to 10 servings of fruits and vegetables a day, which is astonishing, right? That's a lot. And so we pull these folks aside and we say, tell me about your day, go through your day. Tell me what you eat, it's crazy. They hit it, 8 to 10 servings a day. However, some of the key types of vegetables, these leafy greens and other colored fruits and vegetables, are not anywhere to be found on the list. And so you're not getting, they're not our favorite types of foods. That's one thing. That's one issue. So lack of consistency. Most of us, we eat a salad, every couple of days or something, and that's great. It's good, generally healthy, but if it's, romaine lettuce, mixed greens, certainly not enough of these types of nutrients. The other issue is the quality of the food that we're seeing, in the modern day. This is not just me talking. It's not some conspiracy theory. It's data from, the United States Department of Agriculture. You look at spinach, a bowl of spinach from roughly 1950 compared to a bowl of spinach in the year 2000. The nutrient density of that spinach, and this is across the board, all nutrients, is decreased by 1/43. I mean, this is, you take the spinach down, you have to eat 43 bowls of a 2000 spinach versus a 1950 bowl of spinach. And so, sounds crazy. And now, that gets to the point that, in terms of processing, spinach in 1950 or 1953, I believe is the exact date they analyzed. This is grown outside in the sun, struggled. The plant upregulates protection for itself in the form of lutein. And so, it's like really good wine. You want the grapes to struggle, almost die, and they upregulate all the good stuff. Same thing with spinach, or other plants. Anything we eat, really, they synthesize their own protective factors. We eat those things, spinach in this case, we derive the benefits. Now, in the modern day, of course, processing, trying to get the most, volume to the grocery store, companies grow largely the spinach inside. Under fluorescent lights, they don't struggle. They have plenty of water and nutrition. They don't have to upregulate these protective factors. And consumers generally prefer the soft feel of the sort of weak baby spinach leaves, which are the ones that you actually want to avoid if you're going to choose spinach. You want spinach is rough and, has barky stems. Anyway, it's not all spinach is created equally, but, to guarantee that you're getting enough, supplementation is a no-brainer. I just, there's no other way. We see studies, we take blood and people claiming to eat a lot of these nutrients just don't have it in their blood. They're either lying or the quality of food is not good. You get them on a supplement and then boom, it's up there and it's consistent. When it's consistently high in your bloodstream, body knows what to do with it. That's when you start moving the needle in the eye, the brain, cardiovascular tissue, all of these benefits come. So
I know I told you I'd kind of be respectful of your time, but I'm not going to do that because I still have another question about omega-3s. When you think about what's important related to omega-3s, and we'll specifically, I know you mentioned brain health, but specifically related to ocular surface issues, what do you think is important? Why do we get sometimes we'll see big studies like the DREAM study that everybody kind of says, oh, omega-3s aren't helpful, but then you get a lot of other smaller studies that do find a benefit based on symptoms. And what's your thought on that? How should we be thinking about it?
Yeah, again, it's a tricky thing with studies, and we discussed AREDS, another sort of large government-funded study before, found benefit, and indeed the DREAM study technically found benefit. It just wasn't versus an olive oil placebo. There are, with large studies, you get to say, well, we had a lot of people in the trial. You can extend this to pretty much anybody if you have findings. And that's a great thing. Certainly, it's a benefit of a big study. A problem with a big study is, variability. You've got, compliance issues potentially. And also with the DREAM study, it should be noted that, other measures, other treatment modalities weren't restricted with regard to dry eye. So, you got this, I think it was a 15% reduction in dry eye symptoms, which is a benefit. But, where is it coming from exactly? And how, if you're not taking your patients off of other, sort of treatments for dry eye, how do you differentiate? And so the overwhelming evidence, it's sad, it's frustrating, to see results like that from the DREAM study. But the overwhelming evidence, like you mentioned, for these omegas and in terms of ocular surface disease, they're overwhelmingly hugely positive. And, you only have to look at really carefully controlled trials that look at really specific, meibum profile, lipid profiles, for instance. You find DHA, EPA in there. We know the properties of these nutrients. We know where they go, kind of like lutein zeaxanthin and mesozeaxanthin. They actually treat directly. They go in, they find their way, largely these, the clogging up of the meibomian glands. One of the primary cloggers of the meibomian glands is triglycerides. And what do cardiovascular patients get, that have really high triglycerides? Fish oil supplements, which have been shown to greatly reduce triglycerides. So it kind of makes sense. You break up those triglycerides at the meibomian glands. You get this, tear breakup time that, is doubling and in many cases tripling when you go on these supplements. Careful controlled trials, they may be smaller. They may have 80, 100 individuals, placebo control, proper placebo, or no treatment versus, omegas is not exactly what you found in the DREAM study, they're showing this benefit, and it's multifactorial. I mean, the omegas, again, these are things that we don't get enough of, and there are so many benefits to patients. Dry eye is certainly a major one. I wholeheartedly believe in it. You can track your, omega-3 index in your blood, and then look at that cross-sectionally with dry eye, and you find a strong relationship there. Again, it's pretty amazing. You find these pro-inflammatory cytokines on the corneal surface, IL-6, IL-17A, which is highly specific to dry eye disease, reduced significantly with omega-3 treatment. So, there's a lot of evidence. I'm a scientist, and so I pay attention to all the data. I weigh it all, and in my opinion, it's really a no-brainer. The omegas are safe. They've been in the diet for a long time. You just look at the diets of healthy individuals, Mediterranean diet. I mentioned the Hadza earlier. The study of omega-3 intake in the Hadza tribe showed a range from 2.26 grams per day to 17 grams per day in terms of the omega-3s, EPA and DHA. So, it's crazy, right? 17 grams a day. They're averaging around 10 grams a day. So they're eating a lot of fish. This is what human physiology is again, designed on. And so, Mediterranean diet, the Japanese, same thing. Relatively low levels of dry eye disease, despite the fact they're smoking a lot more than we do here in the West nowadays. And so, I think that, it's really pretty clear to me, despite the DREAM study, we're looking at, real benefit to patients.
Yeah, I think the DREAM study missed in a couple ways. I mean, I've made this comment multiple times before, but I think largely we need to be able to look at clinical indicators to show us benefit that are not just symptomatic. So I'll see some studies that kind of counter the DREAM study that do show symptomatic improvement compared to placebo. But then everything else, like all the signs that they looked at, didn't show any benefits. It's like, okay, we get a symptomatic benefit with placebo, but we didn't look at the right signs. So then we'll just kind of scratch our head. I think it's largely related to really two factors, and I'm probably missing some others, but I think it has to do with what you're talking about in terms of MIBM, and I also think it has to do with the inflammatory control or the anti-inflammatory properties that DHA and EPA have specifically. And I think that's the main reason. And I think then if we can target as clinicians, if we can target our patient populations to who are more at risk for those characteristics or who have those characteristics, thick MIBM, inflammation someplace on the ocular surface, and we can measure that a number of different ways, and you alluded to some of them. And I think we'll probably have some of those ways to actually measure it clinically in the relatively soon. I know some of them are already available, but I think that's where, as a clinician, I can say, I know that's why we're getting a benefit, because these other smaller studies kind of point to that. But the bigger studies aren't looking at those things. So I suspect that had the DREAM study looked at other inflammatory markers specifically, they may have found some other association. They may not. I mean, so anyway, that's my suspicion of why the DREAM study didn't have some of the other findings that would have shown it to be a benefit beyond just symptomatic improvement. And then the last question that I've got for you is the difference between reesterified omega-3s and triglyceride form. Is that important? Why is it important?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. It's super important. And just getting back to your comment there real quick, I want to turn every OD into a clinician scientist. I mean, I really think this is a lot of fun. Once you have the proper measurement tools, you can do this. And we get a ton of data from, clinician scientists now, just even if it's informal, I get folks sending me stuff, and it's very interesting. Again, looking at the symptoms that you need to, looking at actual measures, hardcore inflammation, all of that. And one other comment, this idea of ratio, DHA, EPA to DHA. Well, what's the magic ratio and all of that? And it's kind of a silly thing, really, when you look at it, because they these two omega-3s act in, they complement each other. And really, if you look at healthy diets, I mentioned Japanese Mediterranean, the Hadza, you see roughly a 1-to-1 ratio across the board. We largely have thought, and these are misconceptions now, that EPA is the better systemic anti-inflammatory. Not true. We're finding DHA, and I mentioned the meibum, it's doing work there, anti-inflammatory work all over the body. It has, special resolvins that come off of it. So they're equally potent in terms of anti-inflammatory action. We just have a lot of evidence now to suggest that this equal ratio, you give the body what it needs and it can regulate and do what it needs to do everywhere. Now, getting back to your reesterified triglyceride versus ethyl ester, the processing of fish oil, how you refine it, that process involves stripping the fatty acids off of their glycerol backbone, and what that means, the triglyceride. So you have these three things coming off of a backbone, and these are the omegas are here, and this backbone's here. And it's a glycerol backbone. It's the natural way of, it's how it's found in fish. It's highly bioavailable. A cheaper and easier way to get these nutrients to market is to just cleave the omega-3s off of that glycerol backbone, and then they bind to an ethyl alcohol backbone. So it's termed ethyl esters. And so, when your body processes an ethyl ester versus a reesterified triglyceride form of these omega-3s, the product is effectively methanol. So it's an acid. And I like to do the demonstration in a styrofoam cup. If you have an ethyl ester fish oil pill, you can break it open, let it drain into a styrofoam cup, and in a matter of about 15 or 20 seconds, that's burned a hole through the bottom of the styrofoam cup. That's, you're putting that into your body, and that's a bit worrisome. Maybe more importantly, from an absorption, a bioavailability standpoint, the reesterified triglyceride form has exceptionally better bioavailability to the body. It's the natural form. You don't have these byproducts that come off, into the body, this methanol thing, which can, upset the stomach. It can contribute to, the sort of fish burps and other issues that you might have with fish oil supplements.
Jim Stringham, thanks so much for doing this. I learned a ton today. It was a lot of fun to get to know you a little bit better. And where can people find you if they want to hear and read more about what you're doing?
Thanks, Chris. This was great. You can find me on LinkedIn, Jim Stringham, or if you want to reach out directly to me, I have no problem with that. I can send studies. We can chat about things. It's J Stringham. That's J Stringham at MacuHealth.com.
Awesome. Thanks, Jim, so much.